I found it on a Tuesday, cleaning out the church van. We were taking the youth group to Gatlinburg that Saturday, and somebody had left a half-drunk bottle of orange soda under the middle bench, and it had gone over on the carpet, and I was down on my hands and knees at 58 years old with a rag and a bottle of vinegar water trying to get the sticky out. And my hand hit something back under the seat rail. It was a phone, one of those little flip phones you buy at a gas station and pay for with cash. Not his phone. His phone was in his shirt pocket where it had been every day for 6 years. I sat back on my heels in the doorway of that van with my knees hurting and that little phone in my hand, and I want to tell you exactly what I thought, because I've had 10 years to be ashamed of it. I thought, he's got a woman. That's what I thought. That was my first thought, and my second thought, and my third. 31 years as that man's wife and I sat there in the church parking lot, doing the math on which one of them it was. It would have been so much easier if it had been a woman. My name is Lorraine Tate. Most people call me Rainey. I'm 68 years old. I live in Northeast Alabama, and for 31 years, I was a pastor's wife. I've changed the names in this story, including the name of our church and the name of our town. Some of these people are still living, and some of them still go to that church, and they didn't ask to be in anybody's story. But everything I'm going to tell you happened, and it happened to me, and I've never once said it out loud from beginning to end. Let me tell you about the church first, because if you don't understand the church, you're going to think this is a story about a marriage. It isn't. Shiloh Ridge Baptist sits on a 2-lane road about 4 miles outside of town, on a rise, with a gravel lot and a metal fellowship hall that we put up ourselves in 1994. Brick sanctuary. White steeple you can see from the highway. A cemetery on the north side with my husband's people in it going back 4 generations. The town had about 2,600 people in it when we came, and it's got about 1,900 now. I want to tell you who those people were. We had a tire plant. Most of the men at Shiloh Ridge worked at that tire plant, second shift or third, and that plant closed in 2009 and never came back. After that, it was the poultry plant, which is a different kind of work and a different kind of money. If you've never had somebody in your family come home from a poultry plant, I'll just say this. Their hands don't work right after about 10 years, and everybody knows it going in. And they go in anyway because it's what's there. That was our congregation. About 180 on the roll, maybe 120 on a good Sunday. Junior Sipsey drove a rock truck. Faye Renfro cleaned houses in Huntsville, an hour each way. Hollis Pate had been the treasurer since before we got there, and he'd retired off the railroad. Mostly hourly people. Mostly people who knew, on any given week, exactly how much was in the account. And I need you to understand something about how those people gave. In a church like ours, giving is not a spreadsheet. It's a $5 bill folded twice in an envelope with a name printed on it in pencil. It's a woman who cleans houses, putting $40 in the missions plate every single month for 11 years and never once missing, and I know that because I counted that plate for 11 years, and I knew every hand in that envelope by the handwriting. We had a missions fund. That's the part you have to hold on to for the rest of this. Shiloh Ridge had supported a church in a village down in Honduras since 1997. Not a big operation. A pastor, a block building with a tin roof, a school that ran through 6th grade, and a well. Our people loved that. Loved it. There was one Sunday every November where we'd do the missions offering, and my husband would put photographs up on the projector, the pastor down there, the children in front of the school, the well, and the plate on that one Sunday would come back heavier than any other Sunday of the year. Every year. Poorest congregation in that county, and every November they'd empty out their billfolds for a village most of them couldn't have found on a map. Now let me tell you about Delmer Tate, Brother Del. I married him in June of 1985 when I was 27 and he was 31, and he took the pulpit at Shiloh Ridge that August, and he stood in it for 31 years. I'm going to say something that people find hard to believe when I tell this story. So I'll say it early, and I'll say it plain. He was good at it. I don't mean he was a good talker, although he was. I mean he was good at the part nobody sees. He was the man who sat up all night at the hospital in Huntsville with a family whose boy went through a windshield. He was the man who did 9 funerals in one winter when that flu went through the nursing home and did every one of them like it was the only one. He buried my own mother. He held Faye Renfro's hand for 2 hours in an emergency room hallway. That man got out of bed at 3 a.m. for 31 years for people who could not do one thing for him. I've had a decade to try to make those 2 men into one man, and I still can't do it. If you're waiting for me to tell you he was a phony the whole time, I can't give you that. It'd be easier for both of us if I could. We raised 2 children in that parsonage. Delia, who's a nurse in Huntsville now, and Cade, who was a youth minister at a church over in Georgia, and I want you to remember that about Cade. And we lived on what that church could pay, which was $31,000 a year at the end, plus the parsonage and the insurance. That's not a complaint. That was what they had. I worked 22 years in the front office of an elementary school, and that's what put our kids through school. So when I say I never suspected money, I want you to understand why. We didn't have any. There was no boat. There was no second house. That man drove a 2004 Silverado with 190,000 miles on it until the year everything came apart. That's what makes it work. That's the whole thing right there. Nobody looks at a poor preacher in a poor church and thinks about the books. All right, October of 2016, the van. I took that phone into the fellowship hall and I sat down at one of those long folding tables and I opened it up and it wasn't locked. I want to say that again. It wasn't locked. 31 years I'd been married to a careful man. He was careful about everything. He'd read a church bulletin 3 times before it went to print. And he'd left this thing under a bench seat in a van that 11 other people drove, unlocked, with everything on it. I've thought about that more than almost anything else. I don't think he was careless. I think part of him wanted somebody to find it. If you've ever found something you weren't looking for, a phone, a letter, a bank statement, a receipt in a coat pocket, and you sat there for a minute before you looked at it because you knew that once you looked, you couldn't unlook, hit that like button. I've never met a person that happened to who forgot where they were standing. There were no photographs on it. That's the first thing. I went straight to the pictures the way anybody would, and there weren't any. Not one. There was one telephone number in the contacts, and it was saved under a single letter. R, and there were text messages. 40-some-odd of them, going back a little over 2 years, and I read every one of them sitting at that folding table while the heat kicked on and off in that metal building, and I did not understand a single thing I was reading. They weren't romantic. There wasn't one word in there you couldn't have read out loud in church. They were about money, short, flat, the way 2 men text about a load of gravel. Did it clear? Not yet, Friday. Don't run it through the card. That one has to come out of the other account. I can do 3 this month, not 4. Wait till after the 15th. And one that I read probably 9 times in a row, because it was the only one with a name in it. It said, Hollis signed them all. They're in the folder. Hollis Pate, 84 years old, our church treasurer for 30-some years. A man who had signed the back of my children's birthday cards. I sat in that fellowship hall until it got dark outside. And here's the strange thing. And it's the reason I know I'm telling you the truth about myself. Somewhere in that hour, sitting there in the dark, not understanding one word of what I'd read, the feeling in my chest changed from the sick feeling to something worse. Because a woman I could have survived. A woman is between 2 people. A woman would have wrecked me and my children, and that's all. Whatever this was had other people's names on it. I put that phone back exactly where I found it. I want to be honest about why. It wasn't strategy. I wasn't building a case. I was 58 years old and I was scared, and I put it back the way you put back a snake you didn't mean to turn over. Then I went home and I cooked supper, and my husband came in at 6:30 and said the Hendricks boy was back in the hospital and we ate. And I watched him bow his head over a plate of butter beans and say grace, like he'd said it 11,000 times before. Because he had. I did not sleep that night. I don't believe I closed my eyes one time. And the next morning, I did the thing that took me 11 days, and that I'd do the same way again. I went and got the church's own records. Not his. The church's. Anybody at Shiloh Ridge could ask for those. It was in our bylaws. Any member in good standing could review the financial records with a week's notice. And in 31 years, as far as I know, not one person ever had. I asked Hollis Pate for the Missions Fund ledger and the bank statements. I told him I was putting together something for the November Missions Sunday. A history. 20 years of giving, what it built, where it went. And that dear old man was so pleased. He got the box down himself. He said, "Rainey, they ought to see that. They ought to see what they'd done." I took that box home and I spread it across my kitchen table, and it took me 9 days, and I am not a bookkeeper. I ran a school office. I know how to make a column add up, and that's all I know. That was enough. That's what I want people to hear. It didn't take a forensic accountant. It took a woman with a calculator and 9 days and a reason to look. Here's what I found, and I'm going to say it as plain as I can. Our missions fund was a designated account. When you put a $5 bill in that plate in November, it did not go into the general fund. It went into its own account at the bank in town, and it could only be spent on missions. That was the promise. That was the whole reason people gave to it, because they knew a designated dollar couldn't get eaten up by the power bill. The checks came out of that account made payable to Shiloh Ridge Missions Outreach. And for about the first 10 years, that was right, because that was just what we called the thing we were doing. But in 2007, somebody had gone down to Montgomery and registered a corporation. The name of that corporation was Shiloh Ridge Missions Outreach, Incorporated. It had a president and it had a bank account. And after that, every check written out of that fund, in the handwriting I had been looking at since 1985, made payable to a name that 400 people in that county thought meant the church, went into an account that belonged to one man. 9 years. I added it 3 separate times, and I got a slightly different number every time, because some of those years the paperwork's thin. And the number I finally settled on was around $240,000. $240,000 out of a church where the pastor made $31,000 a year and the men worked second shift at a poultry plant. Now here's the part that put me on my knees on my own kitchen floor, and I mean that literally. Some of it went to Honduras. Not most of it. A little of it. $3,000–4,000 a year, out of 30 or 35 that came in. Enough to keep that block building open and that pastor down there answering the phone. Enough that when my husband called him in October to ask for pictures for the November service, that man sent pictures. Real church, real children, real well. Every November for 9 years, my husband stood up in front of those people and put photographs of real children on a projector screen, and then took the plate money those people gave and put it in his own account. He kept the slideshow running. I have forgiven that man for a great many things. I have not gotten all the way to the bottom of that one. There's one more thing in that box, and then I'll move on. Faye Renfro cleaned houses in Huntsville. An hour up and an hour back, 5 days a week, for 26 years. Her husband was on disability after a back injury at the tire plant. Faye put $40 in the missions envelope every month for 11 years and never missed one. And I know she never missed one because I counted that plate and I knew her handwriting. 11 years, 12 months a year, $40. $5,280 from a woman who cleaned other people's houses. I sat on that kitchen floor with that ledger and I said her name out loud in an empty house. I confronted him on a Sunday night, the 9th of October, 2016. I'd asked him to come sit at the kitchen table, and I had the ledger and the bank statements laid out, and I had that little flip phone sitting on top of them. And when he came through that door and saw it, he stopped in the doorway, and he did not say one word. He didn't ask what it was. He didn't ask where I got it. He didn't say, "Rainey, I can explain." He put his hand on the door frame and he stood there, and then he sat down across from me, and he started to cry. And I'm going to tell you what he said, because in 10 years, I've never gotten it out of my head. He said, "I've been waiting on this for 9 years. Then he told me the whole thing, and it took about 40 minutes, and it was not what I expected. It was so much smaller and so much sadder than I expected. In 2007, a man out of Birmingham that he knew through an association meeting brought him into a land deal. 12 acres out by the interstate. Dell put in $11,000, which was every dollar we had in savings, and he did not tell me, and I want you to sit with that, because that's where it starts. It doesn't start with theft. It starts with a man who is ashamed of how little he makes deciding he's going to fix it quietly. Then 2008 happened. That land wasn't worth anything, and the man out of Birmingham had put more into it, and Dell owed him. So he borrowed from the missions fund. He said the word borrowed, and I watched him say it, and I believe he meant it. $8,000 in April of 2008 to be put back by the end of the year. He never put it back. And by the next November, when that plate came in heavy, there was a hole in that account, and there was a way to cover the hole, and he covered it, and then it was 2 holes. 9 years. He never bought anything. That's the thing. There was no boat. There was no woman. There was no beach house. That $240,000 went to a man in Birmingham to service a debt on 12 acres of dirt that never got built on, and to the interest on that debt, and to keeping the whole thing from coming out. He stole from a poultry plant congregation for 9 years to keep them from finding out he'd lost $11,000. And at the end of it, he looked across my kitchen table at me, and he said the sentence that I've thought about every day since. He said, "If they find out, that church closes." And do you know what the worst thing about that sentence is? He was right. I had that in my hands for 33 days, and I want to walk you through those 33 days honestly, because this is the part people get wrong about a thing like this. Everybody thinks the hard part is finding out. The hard part is the month after you find out, when nobody knows but you, and you have to keep making supper. Let me lay out what was actually on both sides of it, because I promise you it was not obvious. If I said nothing, the money kept going out. Faye Renfro kept putting $40 in that envelope. That's the side of it that never let me sleep. But if I opened my mouth, here is what I knew would happen. And every single thing on this list did happen. That man was 62 years old, and he was going to prison. Our son Cade was a youth minister at a church over in Georgia, and he was going to lose that job, and he did lose that job, inside of 5 months, and nobody ever said why out loud because they didn't have to. Shiloh Ridge was going to split, and the ones who left were going to say it was my fault, because a congregation that has just found out its pastor is a thief cannot survive hating him. So a good portion of them are going to need somebody else to hate, and it is always going to be the woman who said it. And that church was the last thing standing in that community. The tire plant was gone. The school had consolidated. That building on the ridge with the metal fellowship hall was where the funerals were, where the Thanksgiving boxes got packed, where a woman with no car could get a ride to Huntsville for a doctor's appointment. If Shiloh Ridge closed, 1,900 people lost the last place in their county where somebody would notice they were missing. That is not nothing. Anybody who tells you that's nothing has never lived in a town like that one. So I want to be very clear that I did not do the easy thing and I did not do the obvious thing. I did the thing I could live with, and it cost every one of us. I didn't tell a soul for 33 days, not my daughter, not my sister. Nobody. I drove out to the cemetery on the north side of that church one afternoon, and I sat on the ground next to my mother's headstone for about 2 hours, and I'll tell you what turned it, because it wasn't scripture and it wasn't prayer, although I did plenty of both. It was a number. I kept thinking about Faye's $5,280, and I thought, if I keep this quiet, I have decided that Faye Renfro's money is worth less than my husband's freedom. I have made that decision on her behalf, in her own church, without telling her, and she will keep handing me the envelope. There was no way to be loyal to him without stealing from her. Somebody was going to get robbed either way, and the only question in front of me was whether it was going to be the man who did it or the woman who cleaned houses. That's it. That's the whole thing. It took me 33 days to see something that simple. If you've ever had to choose between protecting somebody you love and telling the truth to somebody who trusted you, hit like on this video and tell me in the comments what you did. I'm not going to judge one soul who reads this. I know exactly how heavy that is. I gave him a way out. I want that on the record. I sat him down the second week of November and I told him, the mission's Sunday is the 20th. You will stand up in that pulpit and you will tell those people yourself, all of it. The corporation, the 9 years, the number. You will tell them, and then you and I will walk out that door together and we will face whatever comes. And I said, if you don't tell them, I will. He agreed. He didn't argue. He didn't bargain. He took my hand across that table and he said, that's right. That's how it ought to be. And I believed him. After 31 years, I believed that man, and I would like the record to show that I was still capable of believing him on the 15th of November, 2016. Sunday the 20th. It rained that morning. I remember because the gravel lot was soft and Hollis Pate's daughter had to help him from the car. That church was full. It was always full on Missions Sunday. He got up and he preached for about 25 minutes, and it was on the prodigal son, and it was one of the finest things I ever heard him do. He talked about the walk home. He talked about how the hardest part of repentance is not the sorrow, it's the walking. He had 2 grown men in the 3rd row crying, and I sat in the 2nd pew on the left, where I had sat for 31 years with my hands in my lap, and I thought, he's doing it. Right now, he's walking up to it. Then he closed his Bible, and he said, before we take up the missions offering this morning, I want y'all to see some pictures. And the screen came down. I have never in my life felt anything like what went through me when that screen came down. I have buried both my parents. That was different. That was the floor going out. The children in front of that school came up on the screen. And the well. And that pastor down there in his good shirt, standing in front of the block building, waving at a camera for a congregation that was about to hand over its billfolds one more time. He had gotten new pictures for it. He'd called down there in October and asked for new ones. I stood up. I'd like to tell you it was brave. It wasn't brave. My legs did it. I was on my feet in the 2nd pew, and the room went quiet in a way I have never heard a room go quiet, because a woman does not stand up in the middle of the service at Shiloh Ridge Baptist Church. And my husband looked at me from that pulpit, and his face. I've never been able to describe his face. It wasn't anger, and it wasn't fear. It was relief. I said 7 words. That's all I had. I said, Del, tell them about the other account. And he stood there for what people later told me was about 10 seconds, and what I promise you was an hour. And then that man set both hands on that pulpit, and he told them. He told them for 11 minutes. He didn't leave anything out, and he didn't make one excuse, and he never once looked at me while he did it, and when he got to the end of it, he asked Junior Sipsey to come up and take the service. And he walked down the aisle and out the front door of that church, past 4 generations of his own people in the ground on the north side, and he sat in the truck in the rain until it was over. I want to tell you the rest quick, because the rest is just consequences, and consequences are always shorter than people think. The deacons met that Wednesday. It was not close. They voted to turn it over. He pled guilty in the spring of 2018. He got 41 months and an order for restitution that he will be paying until he dies, and that will never come anywhere close. He served a little over 3 years and came home in the fall of 2021. 61 people left Shiloh Ridge in the first 4 months. About half of them told somebody it was because of what he did, and about half of them told somebody it was because of what I did. The church did not close, and I want to tell you exactly why it didn't, because this is the only part of this whole story that I'm glad about. At the business meeting in January, when it looked like that building was going to go dark, Faye Renfro stood up. Faye Renfro, who had lost $5,280, $40 at a time. And she said, and I'm not going to get this exactly right, but it was close to this, she said, I didn't give that money to Brother Dell. I never gave $1 to Brother Dell in my life. That was it. That was the whole speech. They voted to stay open. Shiloh Ridge has a pastor and about 90 people, and they read the financial report out loud, line by line, in front of the whole congregation 4 times a year, and any member can pull the ledger with no notice at all. It's in the bylaws now. Phase on the committee. 90 people is not 180. But it isn't a padlock either. Now the part everybody asks about. I did not divorce him. I drove 2.5 hours each way, and I sat across a table from that man once a month for 3 years. And when he came home in 2021, I let him come home. There are people in that town who have never forgiven me for turning him in. And there are people in that town who have never forgiven me for taking him back. And I have made my peace with the fact that a good number of them are the same people. Here's what I've got at 68. I did not stop loving my husband. I have loved that man since I was 26 years old, and I expect I will die loving him. And none of that was ever the question. The question was whether loving him meant covering for him. And it never did. Not one day. Every hour I stayed quiet in that 33 days, I wasn't protecting Dell. I was helping him steal from Faye Renfro. That's all silence ever is when you already know. It isn't loyalty. It's just a slower way of taking the same side. He'd have gone on for another 9 years if I hadn't come across that phone under a bench seat. He told me so himself. He said the only thing that was ever going to stop him was getting caught, and the only person on this earth close enough to catch him was me. So I want to ask you something before I go, and I'd really like to know. If it had been your husband and your church and your town, would you have stood up